Today, I'm going to need your help for this sermon, okay? I know that we're not face to face, but I want to try to make this as meaningful and memorable as possible. And to that end, I want to make this interactive. And so here's what I'm going to ask you to do. That wherever you're watching this, whether it's in the living room with your family or a group around the dining room table, I want you to shout out the answers to questions that I'm going to be asking in a moment, okay? Because I'm going to mention some familiar phrases from some famous speeches or popular movies. And if you know the answers, then I'm going to invite you just to shout out those answers right there where you are. And see if you can be the first one in your group to answer correctly. Okay, are you ready? Let's do this. Who was it who said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind"? Let's try another one. President Ronald Reagan said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this." Let's stick with U.S. presidents for a moment longer. What president in his inaugural address said, "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country"? Let's jump to another inaugural address. It was FDR who said, "The only thing we have to fear is..." Now let's switch gears for the next few. The first questions were for history buffs. These questions are now for movie buffs. Does anyone know the name of the 1975 movie where you'll hear the phrase, "You're going to need a bigger boat"? This was going to be a little bit harder. In 1995, the Apollo 13 movie was famous for this memorable line. Houston. In the 1939 movie Wizard of Oz, Dorothy said, "I've got a feeling we're not in..." What popular movie franchise is famous for introducing the phrase, "May the Force be with you"? Now, a lot of you know these answers. You see, there are famous phrases that are memorable, and then there are famous phrases that are meaningful. And they're meaningful because they are motivational. They inspire us to take action. JFK's Ask Not speech inspired a generation to see the importance of civic action and public service. FDR's Fear Not speech brought hope to a generation of Americans struggling to make ends meet as they were at the depth of the Great Depression. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech invites us all to judge a person based on the content of his character and not on the color of his skin. Back in November of 1863, a crowd of 15,000 converged in the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The occasion was the official dedication of the National Cemetery on the site of one of the bloodiest and most decisive battles of the Civil War. The keynote speaker that day was a fellow by the name of Edward Everett. He was a very eloquent man, in fact, one of the most eloquent speakers of his day. He got up first. He spoke for 2 hours. Following him was the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. He spoke for 2 minutes. Now I ask you, does anybody at all remember anything that the first speaker said? But let me quote some lines from what the second speaker said and see if they sound familiar. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now that's how the speech began. Here's how the speech ended. We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. In fact, Edward Everett, the first speaker, wrote to Lincoln afterwards and said this: "I wish that I could flatter myself that I had come as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." Why is it, I ask, that of all the speeches given throughout all of human history, some lines remain in our memory forever and most are just forgotten. It's because they are both memorable and meaningful. And they are meaningful because they are motivational. They move us. They inspire us. They change us. They cause us to want to be different people, better people. And that's exactly what the Sermon on the Mount does. How is it that a sermon given 2,000 years ago on a hillside in the Holy Land is still just as memorable and just as meaningful for us today? It's because it's motivational. It moves us. It changes us. It causes us to want to be different people, better people. It calls us to live on a different level, a higher level of living. You see, even people who have never read the Bible use phrases that come right from the Bible, especially from the Sermon on the Mount. So just as an example, finish these phrases that come from the Sermon on the Mount. And feel free to say them out loud where you're watching. Love your enemies. The straight and narrow. You cannot serve two masters. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. An eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Turn the other cheek. Go the extra mile. Seek and ye shall find. Give us this day our daily bread. A tree is known by its fruit. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You were already, so many of you were already way ahead of me as I mentioned those phrases. Why? Because you're familiar with them. Some of you are familiar with the Word of God and the Sermon on the Mount in particular. Some of you are just new to this. And yet these phrases were still memorable to you. You see, we would all agree that these are memorable phrases. But we would also agree that they are meaningful phrases. And they're meaningful because they are motivational. They move us to want to become better people. As followers of Christ, we want to be the person described by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. For he isn't only interested in changing our conduct, he's also interested in changing our character. This is why he so often goes to the heart of the matter when he says, you have heard that it was said to people long ago, you shall not murder. But I tell you, I want to make you into the kind of person that doesn't even harbor hate in his heart for a person. You see, Jesus wants to change us from the inside out. And that is what the Sermon on the Mount is all about. So I invite you to spend some time in the Sermon on the Mount today, in the next couple of days, this week, in the next couple of months. And as I said in last week's sermon, I love the Sermon on the Mount because in it there is something for everyone. If you're finding it hard to forgive someone, the Sermon on the Mount has something for you. If you're wrestling with an impure thought life, the Sermon on the Mount has got something for you. If your prayer life is listless, the Sermon on the Mount has got something for you. If you're consumed by consumerism and love of stuff, the Sermon on the Mount has got something for you. If you're overwhelmed by worry and anxiety, the Sermon on the Mount has got something for you. If you're living your life as a people pleaser, the Sermon on the Mount has got something for you. If you're dealing with anger toward another, the Sermon on the Mount has got something for you. If you're living a double life, the Sermon on the Mount has got something for you. If you want to find out how to live authentically Sermon on the Mount has got something for you. If you want to learn how to emulate moral purity, the Sermon on the Mount has got something for you. If you want to act with mercy and generosity, the Sermon on the Mount has got something for you. This is all true because the Sermon on the Mount, and in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus speaks with authority, as an authority. That's why this Sermon on the Mount is an amazing piece of literature. It is, as we referred to it, Messiah's masterpiece. But it's more than that. It reveals the very character of Christ. He becomes the perfect standard for us all to pursue. This is why we recognize that the values espoused in the Sermon on the Mount are not only enviable, we also recognize that in our own strength, they are impossible. This is why we turn to Christ, who perfectly personified these values, and to allow Him to cultivate these values in us and to express them through us day by day. So here's what I'm inviting you to do. In the next week, in the next day, take a piece of paper and draw a line down the center of that piece of paper. On the top of that first column, write conduct. On the second column, write character. Then here's what I'd like you to do. Take 15 minutes, 20 minutes tops. That's all it'll take you to get through Matthews 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount. And then ask God to help you make one change to your conduct and one change to your character. And write it down as you read through the Sermon on the Mount. And if you make a habit of this, you will begin to grasp the very purpose for the Sermon on the Mount, which is not to fill your head with information, but to result in life transformation. You want proof? Listen to the closing words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Therefore, he says, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. May God help us all to take steps to grow in godly conduct and in Christ-like character for the glory of God. God bless you all.